So this is the third lecture. It's about interviews and focus groups. So interviews are a data collection method that gathers one-on-one in-depth reports on an issue, meaning that it collects information from a person, seeing them face to face in a conversation-like manner. We gain insight into people's experience, opinions, and behaviors. So, for example, if I would do an interview with a person, I could ask them their experiences during COVID. I would have some questions about it. I would ask their opinions about what they thought the government should or should not have done. And I can also collect information on their behaviors, asking questions like, how did you act when this happened? How did you social isolate? And things like that. Now, there are different levels of how structured the interviews can be. So it is on a continuum from non-structured to very structured. So the non-structured interviews are basically a conversation where you might go in with a topic of choice. You might go in with one question and you let the participant guide what they want to tell you, what they will tell you, and how much they're going to tell you about it. And really, it's there is no structure at all. So in terms of a question guide, there is probably nothing. There is maybe one question or a topic, an open-ended question, and the participants lead how they're going to answer it. You get the opportunity to hear from a lot of people, and you don't know how this interview will shape up. There's no structure to it at all. On the other side of the continuum, there is a really structured interviews. Structured interviews are usually done in combination of quantitative methods. So, for example, if I do a survey and I asked about the experience of youth during COVID, I will then have open-ended questions in my survey eliciting some responses, and they're open-ended, but the structure is very much limited to how many questions, what exactly the questions are. Their answer is going to be limited because I will allow for in terms of if it goes on a computer, for example, you're going to specify how many characters of length they can actually type in the responses. It very is much guided by the person who's doing the survey, so the researcher, instead of the participant. So the participant doesn't have a lot to say. They just need to answer a structured question. They're very open-ended, but they're structured because they're part of a survey. They are open-ended responses that are the same for everybody, and they are very usually there's 5 to 10, let's say, after a survey. By themselves, they don't give a lot of detail, they don't give a lot of data, and all the data will be the same because all the questions are the same, and there isn't much variability in the responses you will get. There's still some kind of story because you will get to code it for themes, but they're more likely to elicit generic data, and data that is limited because it's not the main focus of the project. In the semi-structured interviews, that is mostly commonly is used right now, and you will get an open-ended flexible flow, which means that you're going to have an interview guide much like the structured interview styles, but you're gonna have an interview guide that has questions and probes, and you don't have to go one by one in a specific order. You can be flexible about what you're gonna ask first, and maybe based on what they said you can skip a questions, you can add questions to create a more flexible flow of a conversation like interview. And it really is the participant that is leading it, but you're kind of guiding it. So semi-structured is like the middle of the structured and non-structured. It's the middle zone where you're allowed to be flexible, you're allowed to ask certain questions. You can allow to probe. Probing means that you're asking other questions to elicit more information. So this one is mostly done and also mostly very, very popular in research and ethics. A lot of people submit this way to ethics because it's almost opening the door for the researcher to change some things around without doing huge modifications to the ethics document. So it's very important to know that structured interviews are most commonly held in today's world. Now, with interviewing logistics, you have to schedule and confirm all the appointments. So scheduling means that once you find the person with whom you're going to have the interview, you're going to be setting a date and a time and a space and confirm that they're going to come. If they never met you before, you want to let them know what you're going to look like on that day and what they can look for when they're coming into a space. You have to secure a space. It has to be accessible. It has to be safe. You have to make sure that it's private and also comfortable. So a space that will make some participants uncomfortable, you have to change that space. So a lot of interviewers will sometimes put in some food out and beverages to make the space feel more comfortable. They might have more privacy if the door is closed, but you have to make sure that the space is safe. Some interviews take place in a coffee shop, but you have to maintain privacy. So where do you sit and how and things like that. It's very up to you. I wouldn't do it in a coffee shop because of all the chatter in the background, especially if you are to record it. It would be very hard to listen to the conversation afterwards in order for your data to be available to you. It will be really hard. But the space is very important. A lot of researchers have labs and they might choose to do it in a lab area or in an organization that they work with, wherever the participants are. So it's up to you to find that space and the privacy that goes with it. The auto recording, you have to have two methods and you have to test it. Now, you don't have to have two methods, but it's good to have two methods because if you rely on your cell phone and another recorder, it's more likely that if something happens to one, you will still maintain the recording on the other. So it's very common for people to have two methods at the same time and periodically test if it's working. I've had to do a focus group before that I looked at the recorder and nothing was actually recording. So that's very scary for a researcher mid-conversation. So you have to make sure that sometimes you test to see if it's still recording and there is no technological disruptions. The notes that you will take are very important. You have to pay attention to the location, the time of the day, the mood of the person, the atmosphere, what the vibe is like, the nonverbal communication, how they're sitting, how much they're sharing, their facial cues, their arms. Like all of these aspects are very important because they can lead to a better interpretation of the data after the interview. So keep a really good record of notes when you do an interview. Now, sometimes, and of course with COVID, technology-mediated interviews increased dramatically. And in this picture, you'll see that was pretty much me doing interviews and Zoom conversations and focus groups with a bunch of people, taking care of children and a husband and cats and plants. That is something that we've all had to figure out how to do online. It's not new. Like interviews and focus groups have always ran online as well because of geographical issues, convenience, cost, disability, social anxiety. Maybe somebody is not comfortable to meet with you. Maybe they refuse to meet you in person. Maybe it's their preference to do it online. So all these things have happened in the past. It's just COVID had made it more commonplace. So these interviews usually take place over the phone, a computer, any handheld electronic device. They are sometimes the same as face-to-face. In this case, it will be the synchronous mediated one. So it happens at the same time as you would see that person face-to-face. versus sometimes it could happen asynchronous, so kind of like through an email back and forth, or if I call you and I leave a message, you give it back to me after and answer my question in an asynchronous way. Now, of course, it increased due to the pandemic, but there are still advantages to it. And it must be said that there is an opportunity to reflect on what you're going to share and what you've shared when things are happening. For example, on a computer, you can use the chat box, you can reflect on how much you're going to share, and you can eliminate certain things. You have the opportunity to really slow down and be more in control of what you're going to say. Face to face doesn't allow you to do it because it happens at the same time and you might feel uncomfortable, and maybe talk too much or talk too little. In technology mediated interviews, you have to remember that there is a function of the camera. You can be offline or online, it is your choice. You can speak or be quiet and use the chat box. So there's really advantages in how much control a participant has in the interviews when they are technologically mediated. Now, the drawbacks, of course, is that you don't see their nonverbal communication. So, for example, if an interview is happening on a telephone, you don't know what the nonverbal communication is like, or the cues are like. You don't know if they want to be there. You don't know the vibe really. You can gauge that from the voice or the interest level in a voice and how much they share with you, but it's not the same as face to face. There's also limited access and knowledge of how to. So, for example, a lot of people that we had to do focus groups and interviews with computers, some people didn't have these phones with the data. Some people did not have a good Wi-Fi, or they had limited access to the computer because there's so many people now living in your household trying to fight for who's going on this computer first. So it's very hard to do that part online. And knowledge of how to. Some people you're going to interview are not knowing how to utilize Zoom and WebEx and FaceTime. So it's very important that we note that for technology mediated interviews. I mean, when I had to start doing interviews on Zoom and Teams and different technology mediated ways, it was very difficult because every software, every program needed different things. Where you click is all different, where the data is saved is all different. So it's very hard, and I could only imagine if a person didn't know what is happening and if how to exit or where to click a button, and suddenly you're just offline or something, or your camera is on and off. Some people have difficulty knowing how to use these technologies. So it's very important. It's a drawback. Distractions too. While we do stuff online, there's lots of distractions. You can be using Instagram on your phone. You can be watching TV. You don't have to be 100% invested when it's face to face, for example. Then you have to look at me and you have to gauge with me and like have a conversation with me. In technology mediated interview is if the camera is not on, you don't know if the other person is even there, if they're engaged, if they're doing other things while they're talking to you. So it's very difficult. Attrition refers to how many number of participants that quit midway, or they don't sign up to do another interview after. So attrition is very high. They lose interest, they're not engaged as much. The privacy was a huge thing. How do you conduct an interview in someone's home via technology, and you know that somebody's in the house can listen in, and that is on both you and the participant to make sure that you ensure privacy. So do you have people here, and do they have people there, and are they listening in? That's very important also to note. And also it compromises confidentiality. How do I know where this data is stored? Where does it go? Does it go on a cloud? Is the cloud safe? Where does it store the data? How will I get this data and then provide a safe, secure way to lock it somewhere in OneDrive or Dropbox or any other medium that I can use to store it, so it makes the interview and the participants' identities confidential. And then, of course, participant verification. How do you know that you are interviewing who you actually are set to interview? So if I want to interview females who are 18 years old, for example, on their experience in relationships and something, right? I don't know if my interview online is scheduled with who I think is my inclusion criteria because of something that's called a catfish. You don't know the identity of the other person on the other side of the screen if their camera is off. Now, there are ways in data collection too that a lot of people have used, and again, participant verification is very hard. In one of the articles, it mentions Amazon Mechanical Turk. It's a system where an organization or a business, I don't know how it works, but they recruit participants for you. And it's like database of so many participants. And I guess when they do your study, they get something for it. So you I don't know, they get a small compensation, $2, $5, $10 for all these interviews. So they can get you a large number of participants. You just don't know that these participants are who they say they are. What if it's just a person trying to make money on that software? So it's very important to know when you use methods like this of data collection that you know that participant verification is very hard to do, especially online. The tensions, you're always going to have some sort of tensions when you're doing interviews, especially when you don't know the person, you meet them for the first time. And when you're trying to ask difficult questions, it's a part of your job, but you also don't want to be too intrusive. So it happened to me 3 days ago. I've had an interview about something that I thought was not even a difficult question. And the question was, we were trying to find out whether or not the participants who gave us, so it's a study about drug use in communities. So we asking questions like, what do you think are the factors that you see drug use in youth in your community? What are the factors that lead to it? And we're trying to understand through research that it's the community variables, it's the system level variables that are in play, and not so much individual levels. It's not that the individual is using drugs and it's because they are impulsive, it's because they are this. No, nothing of this sort matters to us. We know that the system is broken, and maybe there are places that are more higher up there that makes this drug impact worse. So for example, having a vape shop or weed shop in every corner of every little corner that you go to, that is a system level factor that might play a role in drug use. Having more poverty, or having non-affordable housing, or having student debt, and all these things are system level. It's beyond the individual control. So we're trying to ask these questions. So when I asked a question for, I think it was New Brunswick lady that works in a community, they started crying, and that shook me to the core, because it wasn't even that it was a difficult question, but in a sense, I was asking something that she saw so much of, and they were speaking about how a lot of youth in that rural community overdose. And that was something, as much as I didn't want to be intrusive about it, I had to ask some questions about it. So you always have this tension of what is too much to ask, and what can you ask to get more information for that study. So very tough tension to be in. Another one is that you're trying to actively listen to the participant. You have to paraphrase what they've said without putting words in their mouth. You have to empathize with them, finding ways to relate, but also not overshare and not dismiss their feelings. And you also do that without asking any leading questions. It's very hard to do, as So that's like the main tension too. Another one is attempting to make a good interview. So you're trying to do all the questions and everything, like you thought about your topic, you've selected your questions, and then you're trying to do all that and realize that it's really more than just the sum of the questions. It has to do with so much more. So my question here for the class was, what makes a good interview? And we talked about active listening, being non-judgmental, understanding and empathizing with a person. The article talks about having meaningful knowledge creation together. All these things make a good interview and more. So one of the articles has a list there. So we went over the list together in speaking about what makes a good interview. So really, this notion of active listening, empathizing, avoiding leading questions, being there present, how you start an interview, your nonverbal communication, being respectful and not judgmental, all these key items create a much better interview than just the questions. Focus groups are different in a way. Focus groups are interviews, but they happen in groups and usually 3 to 12 participants. Now, there isn't a rule about how many participants you should have in a focus group, but we've always had a few. How we do it is we always have a few articles that say, the majority say that it's somewhere between 6 or 8, and from a personal experience I tend to go with 6 or 8 for some reason, because it feels like the sweetest number. It's like the middle of 3 to 12. 3 is too little. You can't do a focus group with 3 groups. We've done those before, and there is very limited data, very limited talking. They mostly agree with each other or disagree with each other, and that's the data you get. With 12, it might be too much. Some people don't like speaking in larger crowds. They get more shy. So it's very, very important to know that maybe the middle ground is best here. Always over-recruit, because less people show up at the end of it, that's for sure. So if you are aiming for 12, recruit 15 or more. If you're aiming for 8, recruit around 10 and 11, because a lot of people don't show up last minute and you don't want to end up with 3. Another aspect of it online, I've noticed through the COVID interviews and focus groups we've done, is that we tend to go with the number of people that will show up on a computer at the same time. So Zoom, for example, if you look at Zoom and you look at the gallery, how many pictures of faces can you fit in a gallery without it going to the next page? That for us was always the key, because we didn't want to go back-to-back pages using the arrow to go to the next page and then seeing other 6 people. I forgot how many people are in one window, but I think it's about 9 or 12 without having to go to the next page. So we always try to stick to that number, to see as many people on one screen as possible, and then you get to see all of them, hopefully, if all of the cameras are on. That was always very exciting for us. And they usually use it to explore participants' expertise, experiences on a topic that might be a little bit sensitive, for example. So a lot of focus groups tend to be from business-oriented field. Marketing, if you have a product, you gather a focus group and they let you know their preferences and experiences with this product. Social sciences kind of took that and we also do focus groups to learn about individuals' experiences and group makes it really fun to do it in, because a lot of people start talking, they agree with each other, they disagree with each other, they add on each other's points. You get a very rich data in a focus group. And so some people decided to save these for sensitive topics. So if something is super sensitive and you don't know how to do an interview with that, or it's your preference to do a focus group, you kind of save it and you do a focus group instead, because you feel like maybe in a group they will talk more about it if they all have sharing that experience together. And it usually includes a facilitator and a note taker. A facilitator is able to know who's going. It can kind of create a sense, kind of like a conversation going, saying who goes next, who's speaking. If two people speaking at the same time, they stop them and say, okay, please talk one at a time, and they ask the questions, and then a note taker sits in the back, and they're the one taking notes about the atmosphere and the vibe of the group, non-verbal cues and communications, how is it feeling, the time of the day that the focus group was running for, and all that stuff. Now, the benefits and the values, so you have something that's called a group effect. So it's the ability to offer insights that are only a result of the group interaction. So basically saying that you tend to speak in a group, you feel safer where others agreeing with you. It's almost becoming a group effect. So if someone said something, then suddenly everybody agrees with that. If somebody said something else, then everybody agrees with it, and you kind of discover why they agree with it, but also that this insight is now only a result from the group interaction. If you didn't have that group interaction, maybe you wouldn't know that others agree with it too. You would have to do individual interviews to figure it out. But really, because people feel safer when others agree with them, it becomes this group effect. You talk more, and then the other one shares something about it. Now, it's more creative and can include polling and ranking, so that's really fun to do. So if you've ever been on Instagram, you'd notice like a lot of people who are influencer on it have some polls and ranking. We also can do it during focus groups, which is fun. We use something that's called Mentimeter that allows you to poll and rank at real time, and you ask question and then a bunch of people rate it, and it's really fun to do during focus groups. It keeps the focus group going and them being more engaged in it. Now, it's great to use when participants have a shared experience, identity, history, or goal, which means that when you go to get a focus group, make sure that they have something shared, like a shared experience. Maybe they share an identity, maybe they're the same type of children and youth from 12 to 18, but something has to be shared. Otherwise, they're all different people. And how are you going to talk about different people about what they're experiencing, or about a topic of your choice, right? You have to have, if you're trying to study concussions, for example, maybe one group will be that all of them are young athletes, for example. So things like that. You have to have a shared experience or goal or identity. Now, it's great fit for researching sensitive topics, but a lot of the readings that I gave you said, well, yes and no. Sometimes it can be so sensitive that it might not make others speak much. You might not be comfortable speaking a lot if it's very, very sensitive. So what do you think? It's still very debated. And it might create a selection bias. So everybody that you choose then, for example, will be extroverts. Extroverts who like to be in big groups. Everybody who you choose, well, maybe those are really good with technology. So now you have people that are not really a part of representative of the population. They just biased by the fact that you've selected for them. So because you're saying focus groups, inhibited people or shy people are not going to select to be a part of a focus group. So maybe there's something there, some kind of bias. But it's also regarded as fast and inexpensive, because you're not doing many interviews after an interview after an interview. You're killing two birds at once, basically. You're having a bunch of people in talking about a topic. You get a rich experience, like a vast experience of stories. So it's fast because you get a lot of people at the same time, and it's also inexpensive. So meaning that your compensation can be, I'll bring pizza and everybody's happy, versus an interview you have to pay for a person X amount of dollars to gain their access to that information. So your compensation level ends up being more creative. You can cut costs that way. Now, other drawbacks is that if you don't have a shared experience, like I said, you might create a focus groups made of different people that hold different opinions, and it's not going to be really good. A bit more demanding on you, because you have to not only focus on asking the questions. You have to pay attention to the group behaviors, interactions. If there's one person that's dominating the conversation, you have to somehow figure that out. You have to make others talk too, but you really can't force them. It's very much harder and demanding on you. There's also a lot going on with focus groups. With interview, you have one person to schedule and confirm. Suddenly focus groups, you have to do so much more work to confirm a place and everybody's availability, and you have a bit less of control over what's going to happen. So in a interview, you have if face-to-face or technology mediated, it's the fact that you have one person to worry about and you can give them some control in how much they want to share with you. In a focus group, that doesn't happen. You don't know who's going to share and how much. You don't know if they're going to speak. You don't know what's going to happen. I've done focus groups that everybody were quiet and nobody wanted to talk at all. So that really does happen, and you have less control over how you're going to proceed with it versus an interview. Logistics, of course, are the same. You have to have the space and the access. You have to think about how many people you're going to use in a focus groups and what the grouping will be like. So meaning if you are going to group age in a way that you have a lot of older people and a lot of younger people, that might be problematic because the younger people might not want to talk. So how you're going to group them and what your exclusion criteria, inclusion criteria will be is very important. Confidentiality, how you're going to guarantee that nobody's going to share what they've heard in the focus groups with others, and how you're going to maintain the identity of the participant private. The format is also something you're going to have to think about it. Are you going to do it face-to-face or online? If online, you have to note on what medium, how you're going to send it through, who's going to have access to that link and all that. Facilitators' abilities and focus, so you have to also pay attention to who the facilitator would be. If it's someone who's not very engaging, you're going to lose the interest of the group, so that's very difficult. And you also have to have a note taker because there's so many elements to a focus group that's happening at the same time. You might always want to have a note taker at the end who is going to sit in and really just pay attention to the time of the day, how much they talk, who talks, gender, the age, and what they're talking about. This is just another comparison for you. So really, if you have to choose interviews or focus groups, they're really much depending on you. What is your interest? What do you like to do, interviews or focus groups? The topic, maybe it's sensitive, more shameful. Maybe you do want to do a focus groups for that. Resources, how much time and money do you have? What the participant pool looks like. Do you have a lot of people? Can you put them all together? Do they share some kind of experience? Then you can collapse them together into a focus group. Participants, like I said, do they have the same reference point or not? And time and money are really important. So if you don't have a lot of funding, you can't pay 10 interviews $10, for example. So maybe you want to do a focus groups with these 10 people and give pizza for everybody. So something where you can cut some costs too. Now, the features for both methods you have to consider is that planning a qualitative interview or focus groups have to do with recruitment. Who you're going to get, how you're going to get them, where you're going to get them from, where you're going to schedule it. The location is key because it has to be safe and secure and private. The transcription part is very important too because you have to be aware of your audio. You have to make sure that the transcription, once you actually listen to the audio and you type it up verbatim, means that you're going to have a rich data to work with. Active listening and building relationships is key. If you're not going to listen actively, participants tend to notice and they're going to lose interest in the study. If you don't build a relationship with them, then they just consider themselves as another participant. So that's really where you have a control on how much you build these relationships and how. You usually can go meet them before the interview to introduce yourself, to tell them what the goals are, and so on. And nonverbal communication, yours and the participants. If you come into the room and it's the last interview and you're just wanting to go home because you're tired, they will feed off this energy and they will not give you a lot of information because they will feel rushed, not respected, and so on. So you have to be on the whole time, and you have to do it when both of you and the participant are at optimal level of engagement. And you have to pay attention to the nonverbal communication. When people start withdrawing, they will sit a certain way, they will not talk a certain way. Like, you have to pay attention to what they're doing and how much they're sharing and what is happening with the non-verbal communication cues. The questions are very important. I mean, it doesn't make the whole interview, but we have to figure out a way, and for your assignment, to know how to create good, meaningful questions. You have to give a thought to the phrasing of your questions. So in this case, there's going to be no absolute, yes or no, always, never, all these words in them. You can't do that. So I will go over them in the next couple of slides, so don't worry about that. Not leading, meaning the questions cannot be leading, they cannot be loaded, and they cannot be double-barreled questions. They cannot be long and compounded and confuse the participant. You have to also give some thought to the ordering of the questions and the content of your interview questions. So you can't, especially when you're asking about something important and something sensitive, you can't lead with it. You have to build up to it. You have to give some thought about how you respond and paraphrase. If somebody, like I said to you when I had the interview and someone started crying, you have to really think about how you're going to respond to that person, and also how you're going to paraphrase what they just told you. You cannot put words into participants' mouth. This is called formulation. I'll give you an example of it too. And you have to give some thought about the probes and the follow-up questions you're going to use. What are you going to ask them if they are not going to give you a lot of information? What else can you ask that will make them open up more without forcing them to speak? So absolute yes/no questions are questions that I myself started with when I started interviewing, unfortunately, and my supervisor at the time looked at me and said, "Are you going to interview, or are you going to go home in 5 minutes? Because these are not going to give you anything." So my questions were very much yes or no questions. This is no. So please don't do those. So for example, do you always self-care? Not only they're yes and no questions, somebody can just say yes or no and they're done. They're absolute, which means that the word always is there. Do you always self-care? That does not even, it doesn't even sound good to do. So please refrain from adding any always, all, every, ever. All these words have to go. Instead, you can say something like, self-caring is our behaviors that we tend to do for us that make us feel better. What do you do that makes you feel better, to re-energize, refocus, refresh? Like, what makes you feel better that you do on a daily in your schedule? And then they say like self-caring. If they don't do it, they're gonna tell you, but if they do it, they will tell you what behaviors they do. So very good to elicit more responses. Another one is leading questions, where it actually directs the person towards an answer. So having something like, do you always follow safety protocols when performing your duties at work? Well, first of all, there's always, so it's almost like the absolute one from before. Even without it, do you follow safety protocols when performing your duties at work? It's almost like it makes you say yes, because who wouldn't, right? Who would ever tell you like, no, I don't? It's leading you to say yes, because not only you feel like you should, but also maybe it makes you feel wrong, like you when you're not. So you can say, when you're at work, what are some protocols that you follow? They will tell you other protocols aside from safety, and then use safety as a little added bonus at the end. If you really want to describe what they do for safety, you can add it as a probe at the end. So in what ways do you follow safety protocols, let's say? Are there any duties that don't require you following safety protocols? So maybe some work duties don't require you following safety protocols. You want to know about it, but without being so leading. Another one are loaded questions. They assume something about the person. Here are two examples. Have you stopped mistreating your pet? Where do you enjoy drinking alcohol? The second one especially is one that's problematic because it's loaded. It assumes that you drink alcohol. I didn't ask you if you drink alcohol, and it's yes or no. But you can use yes or no if you're gonna ask something after. So you could say, do you drink alcohol? Yes or no. And then, where do you enjoy drinking alcohol? What type of alcohol is your favorite? What is the time of the day that you enjoy drinking alcohol? Things like that. So you can check first, and then you can ask more questions using probes, or you can use skip logic. You can say, do you drink alcohol? And when people say yes, they will answer all the other questions that you have for them. When people say no, you can skip all the questions you want to ask about alcohol, and that's called use skip logic. If they say no, logically you will skip all these questions and you move towards something else. So where do you enjoy drinking alcohol just assumes that you enjoy drinking alcohol. Some people don't enjoy drink alcohol, and you just assume it, because how are you going to answer this as a person who, let's say, not drinking? You'll say, well, enjoy, okay, what, drinking alcohol? No. So very hard to do when it's loaded like this. Another one is a compounded double-barreled question. It's when they ask two things at once. Usually it happens in like a work interview. How many of you guys done that? When you go to work and they say, what is your strengths and weaknesses? That is actually a double-barreled question. You are thinking of weaknesses and strengths at the same time. So you need to separate them, split them into two. What are your weaknesses? When you finished answering that, what are your strengths, or vice versa? It doesn't matter the order, but it does matter if you want to put some thought about what you're going to ask first. So, split them, then ask separately. Example of problematic formulation. Remember, formulation is when you are putting things into someone else's mouth. This is on page 197 in one of the articles I gave you, and it said something like, if after a complex answer, the interviewer says, okay, well, it sounds like you had a really bad experience. Let's move on to the next question. This is you basically judging it. You're putting words into someone's mouth and you're limiting your data, because if you're moving on to the next question, you really just, maybe the participant said something and they, didn't feel like sharing. You can't say, okay, sounds like you had a bad experience, let's move on. You don't know that. You can probe about that experience and see how much they're willing to share, but you shouldn't judge it and shouldn't assume that they don't want to move with that question instead of move to the next one. That's a formulation. The next one is probing. Probing makes you have more in-depth understanding or clarification about a question. You can have it very open-ended and say, oh, can you say more about that? That is a clarification that you can just say, tell me more about it. I just want to know more. And that's fair to do in an interview. Another one you can say, for example, here from page 198 from that same article, the student says, I'm not as stupid as my grades at the examination showed, but I have bad study habits. A probe can say, well, what grades did you get? Or what are your study habits? That gets more information at what they are saying when they're saying, I'm not as stupid as my grades on the examination. Well, what were the grades? Also, it says, but I have bad study habits. So you want to say, what are these study habits? So it makes you get more information about this participant if you're actively listening to what they're saying. Another probe, and more meaning-oriented probe, is, well, you feel that the grades are not an adequate measure of your competence. So Meaning, if he says, I'm not as stupid as my grades at the examination, what else then shows their grade? Like, how do you think examinations reflect a grade? That's a great way to build more meaning oriented understanding about what they mean when they say, my grades don't reflect this exam or something, or the exam doesn't reflect the grades, sorry. So, that these are all really good probes to use. None of them are leading, and all of them are clarifying and getting more in-depth understanding of the actual content. The good habit is to always end an interview on a good note. So the example from the reading was like, what advice would you give to somebody who had recently been in the same situation or position as you? Or what we've done with youth one time, we asked them, well, what do you want to tell government agencies if another pandemic were to happen? What do you want them to do that, would be better than what happened like during COVID? So these youth had such fabulous ideas about what they would have done, and it really shaped that interview to end in such a good note. Like they have agency and power over what they say. So it was really good to see. Transcribing is a process that you listen to the audio and you write word for word what it is. It's very labor intensive. It takes hours. I think it said somewhere that 1 to 2 speaker interview takes, I think, 20 pages, and it will take you, I forgot what it was, 4 to 5 hours. Don't quote me on it, but you can Google it. It's transcribing is very labor intensive, and you used to do it with a pedal. It's called transcribing pedal, but nowadays there's software for it. There is Otter and Google Drives that do it, and they just, or Google something that transcribes for you when you speak. So it's very important that you know that too for this lectures too, if you want to transcribe what I say. It complements field notes, because it really, when it's complemented with field notes, when you have these notes that you've added about the gender of the participants who was speaking, what the setting was like, what was the vibe, all these notes complement these transcriptions. The transcriptions are verbatim, which means that it's word for word of the interview, but then suddenly you get the context. The contextual information is there when you took a record of it. And it's good for fact checking. It means that for accuracy, how accurate was everything and how relevant. So if nobody was talking, maybe your field note says nobody was talking, everything is quiet. That's what, when you do the transcription, you will notice the limited data, and you're like, oh yes, also errors. You check for errors. If somebody said something and the audio didn't come through because it wasn't clear, you were right there. You just did it, so you remember how to add it in or something. So that's very important too. You fact check and you made sure that everything is accurate. There is no errors in it. And then for discussion, we're gonna open it up for next class, but I really wanted to know about the second reading. The second reading was really great because it offered you an understanding of homelessness, especially youth experiencing homelessness in Toronto, which is in our backyard basically. And the experience was shared. There were all youth struggling with homelessness during the pandemic. It had a lot of information about how and why they were struggling, what was happening in their lives. They were all coming from the same shelter. So my question to you is, why do you think they chose interviews over focus groups? That would be a great opportunity to do focus groups. And if they've done focus groups, do you think the results would be the same? Why or why not? Would we get that group effect going and those benefits of them knowing that they're not alone in their experiences? Or did we need to do it interviews, and the authors then inferred what was common to whom and what was a common theme and what was repeated? So that's something really good to talk about. And another one is called member checking. Member checking is when you present the results back to the participants and say, Do you see anything with it? Do you like the way I interpreted it for you? Do you appreciate what these results show? Would you change anything? Do you want this out there? Basically, that's called member checking. I will use a code, I will tell a participant that I'm using this code, and they will be able to tell me if they feel like it was a good representation of what they said, and if not, then how they want to change it. So here the idea is that they said on page 10, while not discussed by many youth participants, staff described a marked increase in substance use among youth experiencing homelessness during the pandemic. So the staff described an increase in substance use. For many staff, this increase in substance use was perceived to be related to the heightened mental health concern and boredom. So this finding is very data driven. They've noticed that not many youth wanted to share that, and staff really described that increase in substance use. What do you see anything wrong with it, or the fact that staff interpreted it instead of youth participants saying it? Do you see anything wrong with it ethically? Yes or no? So that's something really good, important to talk about. And then the last one, of course, are your glossaries that will help you in your midterm. Thank you.